For JD Vance, it was just going to be one of those routine dinners he is accustomed to. Vance knew it would not be anything different. However, a little girl's demand for food was a lot more than just her wanting to eat. It put him into a moment that would change all of their lives. As he gazes further, he recalls the night air had a harsh sharpness to it that penetrated through thin layers of fabric deeper inside the body. They were freezing, similar to how the sidewalk outside Bill's Diner, their go-to restaurant, had been. Located in Cincinnati, Ohio, the reasonably priced diner was extremely busy and was surrounded by a long row of fogged parked cars whose windshields were collecting condensation due to the warm interiors conflicting with the frozen atmosphere outside. At this stage, the restaurant looked busy, with a lot of movement. Waitresses rushed to serve the customers, while silverware clinked and people's voices blended together like a swarm of bees to talk. To him, it sounded as if every table was filled with people playing catch-up after being secluded and locked from socializing with one another. As his thoughts turned, he was immediately brought back to reality from the smell of sizzling burgers, fresh coffee, and warm bread. Something told him that the burgers were going to hit the spot for him today. However, a little girl standing behind the window caught his attention as she aimlessly twirled around right next to the entrance of the diner. She was gripping the straps of her old backpack, and she looked like she was not more than 10 years old. On her head was a beanie that looked way too big for her, and underneath it was a pair of cute pigtails. She definitely looked like she was freezing, with her face all smudged while her oversized jacket barely clung to her thin frame. To add even more proof that the clothes were a tad too big for her, the sleeves picked up her small hands, while the fabric was shredded at the edges. To him, she did not look like she was begging, nor did she look like she was shouting and looking for attention. To him, she was just an ordinary child stuck in a modern world, waiting, hoping for someone to take notice. The door opened, and out came JD Vance, the cold air wrapping around his breath. He breathed out slowly, so he was still feeling the heat from the diner. His sleeves faintly smelled of the coffee he had earlier. His solitary evening had been dull. An old friend and I exchanged casual afternoon pleasantries. Then there was the dinner, and now the brief stroll to his vehicle. He began walking towards the back and to the parking area. But as he started to move to the lot, V gave a short pause. He noticed the girl. Her eyes weren't on him. They were focused on the food that was cushioned in the palm of his hand, the hand that was holding the foam container where the remainder of his meal was foraged, which was the part of the fries and the club sandwich that he had not consumed. Subconsciously, she was biting down on the bottom half of, and then licking her lips. As he assumed the position, he actively shifted his line of vision towards her, and in that manner, he managed to glimpse the motif she was encased within. She had unconsciously locked her lips and pressed them to seal them shut. It was the kind of moment people tend to sail away from. A few people might survey the area and take note of the disconcerting vibe. Then aimlessly, they leave the situation. I don't have the resources or the time, someone else would tend to her. Perhaps she isn't even a real vagrant. But JD did not withdraw. Without thinking, he got closer, and only then did the girl had assumed the pose of looking at him. Her eyes held a mix of emotions that were deeply perplexing. There was a sense of hunger, some form of hesitation, and something more hard to decode. Not fear, but also not complete trust, a guarded kind of hope. "Sir, do you have any food to spare?" Her voice was small, like she was being careful, as if she had asked this before and had been denied too many times. increasingly hollow and heavily breathing, JD slowly forced himself to look at her, then downwards. JD Vance figured, like always, it was just another dinner. Now, a girl was silently asking for food. Tidy it up while asking for a minute, and the words would change, a moment that turns the whole world upside down. The air around was unbearably cold that day, the kind that crept through thin bits of clothing, the deep, settled bones, the competing blocks around Bill's Diner, a small restaurant that is always filled with Cincinnati. Ohio also featured the usual range of lampposts that cars were eternally parked under. Their windshields were fogged, considering the warmth on the inside and cold on the outside. It was simply overwhelming. Inside, the place was overcrowded. I heard like clattering of silverware, the gradual blistering odor of burgers being cooked in oil. Eyes popped open to the spectacle that was the foot traffic, the fight for the brighter half of the nearest diner window. But outside of the fried windows of the diner's resting area, a stationary child holding the frayed straps to an old backpack standing still. She was probably 10. At most, her face was dirty, with her lips chapped and her cheeks reddish due to chilly weather, and her loose coat looked like it was 2 sizes too big for her. The cuff engulfed her minuscule fingers. The clothing was tattered and worn out. She wasn't asking for something, looking for people to notice her. She merely stood there. Her gaze shifted among the individuals that were strolling past her. She was waiting, hoping someone would pay her some mind. As the door opened, JD Vance walked outside, breathing out and watching how his breath turned white in the cold. He began to fasten his coat, keeping the heat from the diner within his coat. Some trace of coffee still resided in his sleeves. Nothing thrilling took place during the evening for him. I could smell hamburgers cooking on the grill. I also could smell freshly brewed coffee and bread. Somewhere beyond the warm light radiating from the diner's windows, a small girl was standing still near the entrance. She clutched the tattered straps of her backpack like they would save her. She looked no older than 10. Her cheeks were pinkish from the cold, and thin face was quite smudged. She wore an oversized jacket that did not fit, which did little to keep her warm. The dye on the fabric was torn and tattered. Neither did she make a scene, nor behave in a way that suggested she was trying to get attention. She simply stood still. Her gaze would track the legs of people that walked by her, as if hoping for someone to pay attention to her. JD Vance stepped outside, and the door closed behind him. Warm air mixed with cold, and he could see his breath. He walked out, still clad in the coat, which preserved the warmth of the diner. He could faintly smell coffee from his sleeves. The evening had not been exciting, just a calm dinner filled with small talk and an old friend, and now the quick stroll towards his car. Before he reached the car, he looked to the side, and through his peripheral vision, he could see a little girl. At that moment, she thankfully wasn't looking at him. Her attention was focused on the meal in his hand. The foam container was pleasantly warm against his palm. Lodged the bits and pieces of the unfinished dish, a club sandwich to which fries were part and remained uneaten. He trailed her eyes, noting how she licked her lips like it was second nature, before bringing her lips together, as though she had caught herself. It was the kind of moment most people turn their back to. A fleeting look, a moment of awkwardness, and then move on, justifying it. It doesn't concern me. There are other people that can deal with it. Why bother? Because she might not be a real beggar after all. But JD did not try to justify. He advanced towards her instead, and it was only at that moment that she chose to look up. Her eyes betrayed many emotions, all at once starving.
Uncertainty and a feeling that was elusive. Almost fear but devoid of trust completely. Deeply seated hope. "Sir, if you could spare me some food," her voice small timid, almost as though she has asked this question multiple times before, and was usually rejected too often. JD slowly let out the breath he was holding in, dipping my head so that my sight was diverted to her. In close-ups, he could see the lumps of dirt smeared across her forehead, the way her fingers gripped the straps of her backpack, knuckles slightly white from the strain. He did not answer straight away, not because it was a hard question, but because he understood this was not just about a meal. It was about how one chooses to treat other people when no one is paying attention. Instead of passing the container and leaving, he crouched down to the girl's level, his knees nearly making contact with the cold pavement. "What's your name?" The girl he was speaking to hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other as strands of her untamed hair blew across her face. "Rebecca," she said finally, her voice a whisper. JD nodded, taking a moment to recollect himself. "Rebecca, have you eaten today?" he asked. Her shoulders lifted in a small shrug as if she wanted to avoid the truth. Not really. JD glanced back at the diner, the open sign casting a dull red glow onto the pavement. He tightened his grip around the container in his hand, but instead of handing it to her, decisions are made in the moment more often than not. "Come on, let's get going," he said. Rising to his feet, he stated, "Let's get you something fresh." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. "As if she expected something completely different," Rebecca remarked. She seemed slightly reluctant and made subtle movements toward the parking lot. It appeared that she delayed because she was anticipating someone to give her permission. "I don't intend on making this a long process for you. Introductions shouldn't be brutally taxing." The smell of grilled meat along with buttered toast and succulent fried fillers frightened her. The activities of those remaining must seem entertaining to some. That level of open curiosity startled JD, propelling him to discuss the glaring inconvenience straight away. It is those groups that have satisfied their grumbling stomachs that the place is busy with. As she sat, she started to regret bringing her pack along, but instead she chose to lower her gaze. Surreptitiously lowering her eyes when JD sat in the seat adjacent seemed to be only remedy. "It could be my nerves," thought Rebecca. Children can be an unexpected source of excitement. Without the diner heater on, the chill would have proved even worse for the both of them. It could be the combination of air conditioning in the diner, along with the toasty turtleneck he decided to wear, and simultaneously with us walking in. JD's focused defiance to rubbing his nose in the child neck crock, which the cabin plunge caused, amuses me. When he sat instead of forgoing his pants socks, I could see now was not the appropriate moment. With lunch eagerly nipping at my heels, I outpaced my trust in Rebecca Shivers. I wonder with aged groups talking to children on conjoined tables if there is a second childhood attached to them. The tension that encompasses narrows gravity's pull, completing the full shift of atmosphere around the pair of us. Snapshot a singular moment. A tension-filled Rebecca sitting on a chair, knowing fully well that she won't be catered to. JD could witness the way her hands were resting on her lap, which was accompanied by hopelessly curled fingers. It is clear that her entire body was tightly wound. An old woman with poached hair walked up to Rebecca and slowly started jotting down notes. While staring at her notepad, she asked, "What can I get you, JD?" JD then outstretched his hand towards Rebecca and replied that she can order whatever she pleases. The reluctant Rebecca was accustomed to getting leftovers. She personally did not mind them as long as it was food being offered. The thought of a menu also baffled her completely. She wanted to add something, but never managed to whilst JD was seated there. Feeling the heavy gaze from the waitress, she knew she had the upper hand. To mitigate the situation, she mumbled, "How about a burger?" And as expected, Rebecca graciously accepted with a side order of fries. She then followed with, and to drink, she paused for a moment. "Chocolate milk?" JD smiled. It was the first time Rebecca made a request. Without thinking, as the waitress started to walk away. Rebecca kept her head looking down toward the table, her fingers drawn over the surface of the table, which was covered in an array of scratches. They sat together in silence. JD allowed the silence to linger before saying, "Where is your mother?" Rebecca's fingers went still. She had not lifted her head toward the shelter. He offered her time to speak, but instead she said nothing. "And your father?" She slightly tightened her grasp on the straps of her backpack. "I do not know," was her answer. JD found it interesting. The manner in which she spoke told him much more than her words. "How long have you been in the shelter?" "A while," is what Rebecca said with a shrug. Her voice was unwavering, but her expression contained something. Tiredness and devastation that absolutely no 10-year-old should have to go through. It was as if she had learned to stop wishing and hoping for things to change for the better. JD leaned back. He watched her, remembering what it was like to suffer through instability as a child, wondering if anything would normalize, ignoring the constant feeling of hunger, feeling the burdens of having to solve adult problems. You are not meant to carry, but it is not just a rough patch. This is something much deeper. The delivery of food alleviated their discomfort. Rebecca adjusted her posture. Upon the waitress's arrival with the food, a large serving of burger with a lot of fries, and a tiny glass of chocolate milk. She did not wait. The thin glass with chocolate milk. Without hesitation, she picked the burger with both hands, just like that. She took a drastic bite, chewing it quickly, as though she was waiting for someone to take it from her. JD kept quiet. Hungry and without answers, he decided to let her eat in peace. Slowly, she put the burger down and took a sip of milk after witnessing the stares around her. Breaking the silence, while placing the unsipped cup on the table, she posed an existential question. Not staring away, JD too answered, "Because you asked." Rebecca bit her lip, thoughtfully, accepting the fact that the majority live life like robots. JD released a deep sigh, moving his hand over the outline of the table. "Most of those who take the step do not know how to help." She hopped. No, but the look in her eyes suggested that she was not entirely persuaded. The collective silence was void of anything but the repetitive sound of dishes being placed aside. For a few moments, her gaze was fixated on the floor, and then she said quietly, "It was never like this, always like this." "What do you mean?" "What do you mean?" JD replied. Looking up, she moved a French fry across her plate. "Before my father was unemployed, we owned a house, a real house. I had my own bed," and he heard her voice shake, but JD could tell something was off. Then he left and the shift began. She did not explain further, and JD did not ask, but he sensed where the conversation was heading. He could see it in the way her bowed her shoulders, in the way she didn't almost gaze his direction. There was more to this story, but something told him, before she would speak, he needed to first earn her trust. As he observed her closely, JD pondered over the fact that her aid wouldn't be as simple as buying her dinner. He stretched his perception to recognize the intricacies surrounding the meal. It became apparent to him that dinner was not about so much as a meal that would end up helping them. Purchasing that food wouldn't offer aid, as her situation was strenuous in nature. The dinner that was in question was not even one that could change matters greatly. One could say it was not even an option. It was almost effortless thinking after all. When viewed out of context, it would make absolute and perfect sense. Now, understanding all this, it would outline the very premise wherein the notion survived. As the meal drew to a close, Rebecca reveled in the sweet, greasy taste of starvation. The fired potato sticks were the last thing on her that she would actually savor, or at least actually manage to take delight in. The dulcet and bedeviling aroma that emerged from the melted oil absorbing into her fry began winning her over in addition to her battered tastes. The initial hunger had genuinely transformed into something that JD now could best define. Not out of jadedness, but evolution. It was the latter after all. The possessive, weary, and grateful feeling ran in rebuke to claim, "I am grateful for the food, but tired because, deep down, I know what lies ahead." A lot encapsulated that night. Shallow was the cold. Deep was the uncertainty. "Your father, Uthid, he is at the shelter and is right." JD set his elbows on the table and began musing over the words she spouted out. It only made it clearer to him that Jode was set out on understanding that girl's dreams as were of a broken bottle, in tatters, keeping in his entourage of children, let out to dispose his mother that goes far and do reason frameworks, any deeper than this. and it would shatter into numerous entities if said together. Far together and without bounds, chasing after was never an option. Chachi's inhalation stood clear to him. Step into a role far too large. Kid comprehend. A child shouldn't have to endure through this grave perspective, knowing they need to taking into account devise a plan to feed. Would you like me to escort you to her? She asked in a cute and unusual way. Do you want me to take you to your mother? Set an example for everything else. This should pretty much work as a catch-all for caravating needs, as well as satisfying your cravings to be satiated. Rebecca noticed one of her shoulders got stiffened. Alone with JD this time, chilling out with him was a whole different affair altogether. He was lower on the intensity scale. Even his frown had a taco-like aesthetic, which made him less intimidating, albeit still powerful. Why did Rebecca seem to care about his negative expression so much is beyond me. How far along are you anyway? If I go back too early, she'll be mad, Rebecca said, avoiding eye contact while biting her lip. JD directed his voice toward why, which leaves me with even more questions about what I should dissect first. This makes me angry, because nothing ever gets better, happens. Their binding looms over both these udgered segments. As for JD, something tells me he is slowly starting to crack. Try someone settled a burden within this temporal zone, but I'm not sure if his chest needs another word to bolt. Without further scrapping the scape, try typing the rest before your palms goes paralyzed in this state of taking too long, shifting between glass bottles that you have scathed along. With a few brisk paces, she made it past the diner. Where the hell have you been? Her tone was both deep and fierce, as though she were attempting to rein it in. She reached Rebecca's arm, not in a way that would be harmful, but rather to draw her in. JD caught on to how Rebecca barely flinched. I was just eating, Rebecca mumbled. The woman finally turned her head to look at JD. Who are you? Her face turned stone-like, with a calm demeanor, just someone who bought her dinner. As JD threw his head back in the chair, the woman's jaw tightened, her gaze flicking to the empty plate. She looked defensive. She shouldn't be bothering people. She's not bothering anybody, JD said while shaking his head. She just asked for food, the woman sighed. Quietly rolling her shoulder, she got closer to JD. Deep lines and dark circles began to portray exhaustion on her surprisingly soft face. JD shifted his gaze to Rebecca. She wasn't able to argue. You can't just run off. She rested her chin against her chest. How long have you been at the shelter? JD said, eyeing the woman's froze hands. He tightened his grip around them. Relaxation returned again and again. Throughout each clenched fist, she admitted, after a few months, this is not what I wanted, but it is what we have. JD nodded, allowing her the space to finish. For many years, I worked for a warehouse, she said in a voice that was strained. Then there was a series of layoffs, which led to other things. Then came the rent hike. That was that. Her speech became short and to the point. Not because she did not want to engage in dialogue, but because she had told this story far too often over and nothing changed. This was not the first time JD was witnessing this cycle. People wouldn't just become homeless out of nowhere. It happened with gradual stages. A job got terminated, one bill was not paid, a vehicle broke down, and soon enough, you were struggling to stay afloat without any support. He exhaled and blinked as Rebecca leaned softly against her mother. A silent indication of what was on the line. What if I could help? JD asked. The woman blinked and was caught off guard. I can help, JD nodded. I know a non-profit organization. They assist families in getting back on their feet, job opportunities, a roof over their heads, everything. The woman started looking protectively, not because she was suspicious, but rather tired of useless guarantees. Politician, what did the woman say? JD let out a small laugh. Like this, she inhaled sharply while rubbing her forehead. Look, I do not require sympathy, her interrupted herself. She said, swallowing hard, I only require an opportunity to solve this. Let me assist you with that opportunity, JD responded, meeting her stare. I will be able to help. Rebecca did not answer immediately. She paused, noticing something in her body language changed. She had faith for the first time since entering the building. Although JD was aware that offering assistance and actually persuading her to accept the offer were two completely different matters. The silence at the table was not instantly dissolved. Studying him with scrutiny, the woman, Rebecca's mother, gave her attention as if anticipating a hidden obstacle. Her indecisive daughter remained in silence beside her. She was well aware of the unsaid condition. Help always comes with terms and conditions. She'd learned that the hard way. Keeping her frail fingers on the edge of the table, Rebecca, who was still resting her head on her mother's shoulder, wasn't used to seeing her mom's indecisiveness. More often than not, decisions are made out of urgency, which is unnatural. "You don't have to make a decision right away," JD said, calm as tone. Evoking suspicion from Rebecca's mother, who was clearly tired, JD's head shook in dismay. "I want you to know that is it an option? You do not know how to perceive this part of the world. These institutions have their own sets of rules and procedures that must be adhered to. It is as if they have set the bar too high and want some sort of proof that they are worthy to be saved." JD noticed the bitterness in her tone. He knew better this is what he recognized as the way the system stripped people into pieces. Only to reconstruct them later, he told her to not worry repeatedly. They do not just provide a bed for the night and pass it off as help. They try to solve the problem. She sighed deeply and rubbed her temples. What if the system does not have a place for me? What if they decide we are not their concern? JD moved his arms forward and leaned on the table with his elbows. "I'll ensure they don't." She started looking at him again, but deeply this time. "What is your motivation? You are not helping her at all, because someone cared about me once and it changed my life." It took a while for his words to absorb into their surroundings. Rebecca looked up. JD was feeling curious, but her eyes looked tired. He did not provide any extra information. He was saving it for later because it was not the time to tell everyone everything. To him, it was about making her have faith. These words were not just another meaningless phrase, but she could not finish her sentence because she was cut off by a voice from the other side of the diner. "Are these, sir?" And so JD turned, confronting a middle-aged man as if a situation arose between the two. Hands worn from work and broad shoulders clip a badge to a belt. Rebecca stiffened. "It's a cop," so did her mother. The officer sanitized his throat. "Was everything okay here?" Rebecca's mother's face turned scarlet. A woman who looked like she hasn't seen a shower in days with a child. The MP cleared his throat and scanned the diner. As he looked away, JD grabbed his jaw. People are uncomfortable looking at this. "Well, I know what this is now," JD responded. "I am with a child and a well-dressed man that looks like a fucking dinner." He knew people didn't want to witness something like that. "I said we're fine," JD proclaimed as he stayed silent, standing still. "We're fine, Roberto," someone else's voice shouted. Her voice sounded like someone who had been barked at like a dog. The type of phone that snaps from a million welts above the skin, slowly cracking apart. The officer stood straight in disbelief, Aaron slightly amused. Central was the further unlock. There are country fences across roads. The other end an open grand space filled with brownstone buildings. Whatever she believes ends with us loosening SK conspiracy shackles around our necks. Rebecca tilted her head and slowly exhaled softly. She was sighing knowing people looked at her instead of the woman her mother warned her to never talk to. "Tell me, how do they know?" she asked in disbelief. "Stop beating the bush. What do you think a collection of strange people have in common? Before people know your designation, you become a headache to them." JD let her words settle as he rubbed his tired eyes. "Like, what's the matter?" Her eyes burnt. "Why don't you get an ounce of shield? She's right, but that doesn't mean I should contaminate the smoke alone." JD began to speak and put his hand into his pocket. Taking out a thin notepad and a pen, he noticed a page and began to scrawl on it. After this, he slid the page onto the table. "This is the number for the organization. If at any point you decide you want to talk to them, just give them a ring. And do not forget, I already informed them of your situation." Rebecca's mother was hesitant, and after a small pause, she decided to pick up the paper. In JD's mind, he wasn't sure she would actually follow through with that, but at least now she had a choice. As JD prepared to walk out, he heard Rebecca's voice. "What happened to you?" The furthest thing from her line of questioning was the one thing he wanted to avoid. "Where do I even begin?" is the answer to her question. With a look of disbelief, he stared down at Rebecca. Having asked in such a meek, nervous tone, for just a fleeting moment he could have been led to believe that this reality did not exist. But she wasn't stopping there, and in fact, those words were now more than confirmed. Her mother now turned towards her child, quietly moved in her seat, effortlessly observing the uncomfortable silence surrounding her. She chose to remain mute while sinning in the conversation, and whilst Rebecca sowed curiosity. JD felt the fabric of his coat and pulled tighter around himself and slowly began to exhale. My upbringing is slightly different than my upbringing, but in its essence, it was quite similar. At times, we had absolutely nothing to eat for dinner, and other times we had very little. My mom, she had a rough time, and then he stopped. His focus was firm. I too spent a large portion of my life in wait, hoping that someone would recognize my presence. Hope that there are those that truly care. Rebecca was twiddling her fingers at the strap of her rucksack. So I asked, did they care? JD moved his head side to side very slowly. Yes, let me explain. There were some who cared, one in particular. He was still able to recall looking out at his grandmother's small kitchen. The familiarity of burnt bread is strong, but my preference is in coffee. Whenever he participated in school skipping, her gaze directed towards him like a wayward knife. She was never rich, but she made up for that in other means because she surely ensured I was never hungry. And she made me think I could escape all of this. Rebecca's mother seemed to struggle swallowing the information she had. Then you were able to escape? JD remained quiet. Yes, but not without deep wounds. These are not the discussions he frequently participates in. People notice the success, their title, their suit, the wonders of life. But what people fail to realize is that for every cycle, there needs to be a parent that resides wondering if that is ever possible. Rebecca sat back, absorbing his words. She had lived long enough to understand that there was more than one way to tell a tale. Her mother rubbed her palms together, wishing for warmth. It's not that I don't want help. She spoke in a softer tone, less confrontational. It's just every time I think we're going to get lucky, we always get dragged back down. Of course he did. He had witnessed it beforehand. Individuals lingering on the precipice of optimism, too unwilling to jump forward due to the sheer number of times they had suffered. What if this time is different? Surrendered the question. He turned to Rebecca's mother, who, after a moment of consideration, too weary to trust in dreams. Right then, the entrance door to the diner swung open again. This time, two men walked in. One of them was the officer from before. The other was a sharp-eyed gentleman wearing a gray suit. As he spoke to him, it was almost like he was whispering, before they both turned to the table where Rebecca noticed the most, leading to her freeze. In an instant, JD understood what was now clear to him. Someone else made a call to them. The officer approached, squaring his shoulders. Ma'am, we received a report about a child that is, in distress. Unlike before, Rebecca's mother was stunned into silence. What she said made her restate pause, panic sharpening her voice. The man in the suit stepped forward and displayed his badge. CPS. We need to ask some questions of you. Rebecca tightened the grip on her mother's sleeve. JD stood in front of her mother before she could say anything. This is a mistake, he said determinedly. The CPS employee showed no signs of emotion. Sir, are you a relative? JD's teeth were clenched. His answer was stern. Number. The worker turned her attention back to Rebecca's mother. Ma'am, we just need to clarify your circumstances. We're not here to take your child. That was the issue, though. That sentiment has been expressed too many times in the past, and it was not always accurate as well. Rebecca's mother's breath started becoming shallower. She has already put in ways to fight too hard to keep her daughter. We are leaving, she said. The officer, standing in the way of her and grabbing Rebecca's hand, restricted her movement. Ma'am, if you continue to choose not to cooperate, we do have the right to take this to the next level. Rebecca breathing accelerated. She has been used to hiding for long, but now the attention is turned to her. JD only had seconds to make a choice. To him, no actions could stand in the way of the power he possessed. Influence. And the last thing he could let them do is let this situation unfold right under his nose. You need to back off. He pulled out his phone. The CPS employee's face twisted with displeasure as she addressed him. Excuse me. We're clear on what steps need to be followed from now on. Remind me how the narrative goes from here. You witness a family that is crumbling apart at the seams, only for you to propose keeping them together, only to contort the family unit even further. Here's where I make my position irrevocably clear. However, if you pursue this any further, all I can promise is that the tale will be loud enough to be heard from any corner of the earth. The worker stood still. The officer began to fidget, became shy with uncertainty. JD did not blink. Assaulting them would help no one. So am I to presume that you have some genuine options in your pocket? I would recommend that you do not ever speak again. Silence hung over them. After a lengthy pause, the CPS worker finally broke the tension first. We will continue our discussion at a later point. He picked up the conversation and walked away. As the officer made his exit, he stopped advancing for a brief moment. Then, as though to express regret, leaned his head slightly. Then began making his way in the direction of Rebecca. She exhaled in a relaxed way, worrying her head now. Her mother had the shakes even now. JD picked up his phone, and that is why, the reason why. He then spoke softly. There's a window of opportunity. No more surprises for you. Rebecca's mother pulled JD's arm so he assisted her in rising from where she sat. With one swift and deliberate motion, hoisted her body off the chair. She nodded this time. Yet gripping onto the back of her head, JD did know how to get her to accept help. He thought that was just step one, with the perplexed JD lightly shaking his head. However, the tense atmosphere and empty chairs was softened. Was the quietness of the diner, while feeling his skin run cold and the sound of his heart painfully beating unknown to everyone else? So I thought, ever since the officers and CPS worker, why looking around the room? As baffled and furious, Rebecca's eyes still remained fixated on her mother's sleeve. She headed the jacket and turned to face her child while her face was clearly worn out, but then again, so was everyone else. Means to say that everyone was in a shared state and hence treated each one with respect. So JD allowed them to have their moment, as he knew how it felt like to be put in a corner, where strangers would assess your ability to survive without providing real solutions. Where does this idea of world ever providing solutions stem from? And why does it feel like the world waits for every one of us to slip up? It was so harsh that Rebecca's mother ended up pressing her forehead with her palm. From where do you think the idea of help stems from? Shed out a bitter laugh and said, then why does it feel like we have to? And the sad part is, she is so right. I know, he muttered slowly, understanding that, yes, everyone is trapped in a system where solitude is the only way out. Eyeing her with slow breaths, he tapped his fingers on the table. He is not just another director, Rebecca. He's the director of the Family Resource Center downtown, the go-to place for help. Rebecca's mother, Sophie, took a deep breath and remarked, I've heard that before, to which JD did not begin to argue. Instead, he pulled out his wallet from his coat pocket and set a folded card before her. Tell them I sent you, he instructed. You won't be waiting on some list. You will not be erased. She gazed at the card, glancing between her fingers, while taking her time before finally grasping. It saw something shift in her expression. For the first time, JD trust was not something she showed, not yet, but it was the start of something close to trust. Rebecca, who has not spoken for a while, her clue led her to say, if we go there, please, does that mean we will never have to sleep at the shelter again? Her mother swallowed, casting her eyes towards JD. For once, she didn't have to guess. And slowly, maybe? The hint of a smile played at the corner of Rebecca's mouth as her small shoulders eased. It was not a promise, but it was a start. It was something positive. JD sat back. The weight of survive slowly lifted the weight of structuring everything, one piece at a time. Rephrase this instead. Even if just for tonight, just then, piece by piece, the same waitress from earlier said to the same table, I don't intend to interrupt. I don't mean to interrupt, but your meals are covered. Rebecca's mother blinked. What the mark was not bigger than an inch. The waitress pointed at the counter where an older man in a flannel jacket sat drinking the last of his coffee. Finishing his coffee, he gave a small nod and turned his face away. He smoothed out the wrinkles on his jacket and moved himself for a bit. He took care of it, Rebecca's mother shifted, watching the man get up and put his coat on and walk out into the cold. She responded with head shaking. I don't quite comprehend. JD smiled slightly. Perhaps someone had all the intention of helping. The waitress, who was restless on her feet, started to speak. She cleared her throat, and the owner stated that if you return tomorrow morning, breakfast is free. Rebecca's mother gaped at her in shock. This is not something she was familiar with. She finally sighed and broke into a breathy chuckle that was harder to believe. I didn't have an excuse not to call, do I? JD shrugged his shoulders nonchalantly. I guess not, Rebecca chuckled. This was the first time she smiled that night. Her mother folded the card and placed it in her coat pocket. Then she stood up, adjusting the old fabric on her shoulders. This was the first time in a long time that she felt this way. She was not leaving with nothing. JD understood that the real battle commenced from then onwards, because one's hope is only as strong as what one does with it. As soon as they got out, the night air greeted them. The cold was equally as biting, but there was something very different with it now. It already felt so much nicer, like how the weight pressing on Rebecca's small shoulders was released, even if it was just a tiny bit. JD accompanied them to the curb, head down, hands shoved into his coat pockets, not quite ready to separate himself from the situation. Rebecca's mother heaved a long sigh, watching the ground for a bit before finally looking at JD. I still don't know why you did all this. JD studied the woman for a moment. Because a long time ago, a stranger did this for me. Somewhere along the line, she's learned not to blink. Didn't offer anymore. Instead, gazing into the world, pondering why some things didn't need explanations. Rebecca used her foot to displace a pebble that was lying around. She thought, will they actually assist us? JD lowered his body to be at the same height with them. I guess the most difficult decision would be picking your choice of selection. You have earned that aid, Rebecca's mother sharply inhaled. More so in disapproval than anything else. She chose not to look at him. Maybe it was because he was correct. Maybe it was because no one had ever framed it in such a manner before. For a brief period, none of them uttered a single word. The sound of cars that was barely audible, an infrequent yip from a stray dog, the neon sign outside the diner blinking. The night continued, and the world seemed to have shifted for this small family. Then slowly, Rebecca's mother took her hand out of her pocket and drew out the card which JD had given her. She felt with her thumb the raised letters, and then, before I could overthink it, she withdrew her phone. Rebecca saw eyes bulging out her as her mother began to call. JD did not need to hear the discussion, so he simply stares at the way Rebecca's mother's shoulders slightly lowered when someone answered the phone. Then in the way her palms stopped shaking as she was explaining her problem to the phone. In the way, for the first time after a long time, she was talking like she was actually saying. She thought things would change. After she hung up, she cleared her throat. Looking up at JD, they said, they will see us first thing in the morning. JD replied with a good nod. Then Rebecca reached out for her mother's hand and squeezed it. For once, she did not need to think about what would happen next. JD stepped back his way toward the car and pulled out his keys. As he opened the door, the story he had for them was finished. The rest was up to them. Rebecca shouted, wait, notice the two figures on the sidewalk. The two figures on the sidewalk started turning smaller in his rearview mirror, and he began to feel like it was not the last time he would be hearing about them. The acts of kindness. What a simple way to change someone's life forever. Ranging further than anyone could see, some simple kindness can corset the delicate frame of a person's destiny when intertwined with pivotal actions. Seems like a few of those seem to exude. The diner disappeared from his sight. JD pulled onto the road after starting the engine. It always means something when choices are made. Now, beating decisions means regrets if taken lightly or relinquished, ending up being a series of terrible decisions regretted. Maybe these were the ones that sprouted doubt, but at least hope was in the picture. JD slided into his car and strapped in, glancing over to his side mirror one last time. Tightening her grip on her daughter, Rebecca's mother nodded to say something, and maybe she wasn't fully being convinced? It seemed like she was saying. Rebecca hesitated at first, but took a step closer after a moment. He replied, you're welcome. Thank you, JD smiled.